Shadow Waltz for Warlock. 5-mana shadow spell. Summon a 3/5 shadow with taunt. If a minion died this turn, summon another. So baseline, this is obviously not very good. It's a Sinjin Shieldmaster for 1 extra mana. But it's pretty easy to make it better than that. Warlock can very easily just cast like a Touch of the Nathrazim or a Mortal Coil or something to activate this. Or you can even activate this on curve by just trading off a Mistress of Mixtures or something. And then 5 mana for 2 3/5 taunts starts to look pretty good. It also has synergy with Tamsin Roam that could give you a 0 mana copy of this. There's another Warlock card coming up that this has synergy with as well. And you could also just play this in an aggressive deck. If you're playing Zoo, you probably have some random 1/1 in play. And on turn 5, you just trade it off and give yourself 6/10 worth of stats. And those stats even have taunt, so they can protect your Knife Juggler or something. I don't know. I do think this card is good, but I don't think the power level of it is insane. I wouldn't be surprised if something like Curse Warlock just doesn't have the deck slot for it. But I also do think it's worth trying out. I don't think the activation on this is very difficult. Shadowborn, 3-mana 3/3 beast for Warlock with Death Rattle. Reduce the cost of the highest cost shadow spell in your hand by 3. So, notably the Shadow Waltz we just saw is a shadow spell. Drag Below, Abyssal Wave are both shadow spells. Tamsin's Phylactery is a shadow spell. Dark Alley Pact, Twisting Nether, Soul Rend. And even if you just hit like Drain Soul, which you don't quite get the full discount on, but it still saves you 2 mana. It's pretty good. There's a lot of shadow spells you'd be happy to hit with this card. And this is a 3-mana 3/3 that lets you cheat 3 mana. So very loosely it can be defined as a 0-mana 3/3. It probably is best that this targets the highest cost shadow spell in your hand. So if you do have a Twisting Nether and a bunch of Drain Souls and Touch of the Nathrazims, you do get to target the Twisting Nether and play it a little bit early. So yeah, not too much to say about this card. I just think it's pretty good. I guess maybe one downside of it is if you hit Dragged Below, then that Dragged Below will cost 0, and you will not be able to copy it with Tamsin Roam, which is very sad. But I do think the card is quite good. Maybe even a Zoo card, and you play it with Shadow Waltz. You can coin this out on turn 2, and then you could trade it off and play Shadow Waltz on turn 3. That could be pretty sick, actually. Lady Darkvein, Warlock Legendary. 5-mana 3/6 with Battlecry. Summon 2 2/1 Shades. Each gains a Death Rattle to cast your last shadow spell. Alright, so 5-mana 3/6 that makes 2 2/1s is a 5-mana 7/8, kind of. So pretty good stats out of this straight up. But each gains a Death Rattle to cast your last shadow spell? I mean, even if that shadow spell is just Drain Soul, then like, okay, it does kind of suck. Maybe you hit your own minion, but you're still healing for 6 off this card, which is really what you want in Warlock. And if it happens to kill your opponent's stuff as well, then this card is just insane. But this can also copy Shadow Waltz, 2/1s that make, I guess they would always make 2 3/5s, because they would have to die to activate the Shadow Waltz. You can get extra copies of Dragged Below and Curse Warlock with this, or Abyssal Wave. Extra copies of Curse of Agony. Extra copies of Tamsin's Phylactery. There's surely something ridiculous you can do with that. This actually just curves very nicely right after a Dark Alley Pact. So I think this card is actually pretty nuts. It's kind of hard to imagine a Warlock deck that wouldn't want to play this card. Even if it's copying like 1 and 2 mana spells, it's still pretty good. And who knows, maybe you could do an insane board clear where this casts double Twisting Nether and deals with your Death Rattle Druid opponent's giant board or something like that. I think this card is just very, very good. Party Favor Totem for Shaman, obviously. 3-mana 0/3 Totem. At the end of your turn, summon a random basic totem. Infuse 2, summon 2 instead. As much as I want to love a Totem Shaman card, I don't think I love this one. It turns out that the basic totems just kinda suck. I don't think there's that much value in summoning a bunch of them. I will say though that Infuse 2 is pretty easy to achieve. So even on curve, there's a decent chance that this is summoning 2 totems per turn. But at the end of the day, they're all just totems. And unless you've played the legendary, I think it's called the Stone Right that buffs them, they're really just not going to do anything. And even with the Stone Right, they're still just weak 1 and 2 health minions. This is a 3 health minion. I just think summoning a bunch of random basic totems is not great. But I guess if you summon all those totems, they're pretty good at infusing other things. Your second party favorite totem, or the Famished Fool that draws 3 cards. Maybe there's some value in that. This could also fit in an Evolve deck, but you don't get the totems until the end of your turn, so probably not. Although I guess the new Evolve card does need to be infused, so maybe you play this because of that. Maybe you really want to play Bloodlust. I don't know. I just think it's pretty mediocre, to be honest. Clean the Scene for Priest. 5 mana holy spell that says destroy all minions with 3 or less attack. Infuse 3, then it destroys all minions with 6 or less attack. Well, once this is infused, it kills a lot of stuff. I would say most minions in the game probably have 6 or less attack. There are some outliers like Naga Giant, but that's why you also play Light Bomb and Whirlpool, right? But even not infused, destroying all minions that have 3 or less attack is like pretty good on turn 5 as Priest against an aggro deck. I do think this card would be much, much better if it was 4 or less, because then you could deal with things like Pet Collector and Ajaran Saber. But the bigger the opponent's minions, probably the fewer of those minions they have in play, the more likely you are to be fine just playing like a Spirit Guide on turn 5 instead of this. And then if they have a lot of minions instead, then you're happy to play Clean the Scene. Even some aggro decks will be able to play around this, like this is maybe not going to be that good against every Murloc board, but it will also be insane against some Murloc boards. It just kind of depends on whether or not they have War Leader or they've cast Nothing Can Happen, or Nothing Can Stop Us. So it's definitely going to be pretty situational, but I think a lot of Priest decks just kind of want to play all the AoE they can. I think this is a fine AoE card. It's probably a fine addition to Quest Priest as a solid 5 mana card. The biggest problem with this card, of course, is going to be actually infusing it. But even if you just play 2 mana card on turn 2, 3 mana card on turn 3, 4 mana card on turn 4, that is 3 things that'll die by turn 5. So I don't think infusing this is going to be too difficult, even in Priest. Ashen Elemental. 3 mana, 2/4 Elemental with Battlecry. Whenever your opponent draws a card next turn, they take 2 damage. So this is actually a pretty cool, like, anti-combo card. 3 mana, 2/4 is a bit weak. Not terrible, but a bit weak. Notably, your opponent is pretty much always going to take 2 damage from this because they do naturally draw a card on their turn. And if you can manage to find a turn where your opponent wants to play like Dreadlich Tamsin or Need for Greed or something like that, then this can potentially deal 8 damage to the opponent, which 8 damage is certainly no joke. So I think if there are decks in the meta that are drawing a lot of cards, this is maybe a pretty good tech card against them. If you're an aggro or a burn deck, or even just generally, depending on how many cards they want to draw. There's also some pretty ridiculous stuff you can do with this card, with maybe like Bolner or Bran to copy this Battlecry multiple times. Or you could try to force your opponent to draw cards with like the Selfish Shellfish. That one's probably not great. But this should also be good with like Curse of Agony, where you shuffle the Fatigue cards into your opponent's deck and then they cast when drawn and they keep drawing cards, so this would do a lot of damage and something like that. So I think this card has a lot of potential. I do think it's probably a tech card and not just a generally good aggro card. But hey, if the right deck exists to be punished by this, it punishes it pretty good. And finally, we have Theotar the Mad Duke, a neutral legendary. 4 mana 3/3 with Battlecry, discover a card in each player's hand and swap them. My first impression of this card is that it is very, very good. A lot of decks in Hearthstone right now really rely on individual cards. So imagine you just play this on curve against Alignment Druid and steal their Lady Anacondra. It's going to be so much more difficult for them to win the game after that happens. Or you even just like steal their guff, and that's a pretty major roadblock for them as well. You could steal a Snowfall Guardian from Shaman, a Belinda from Mage, or their big spell so they can't hit with Barbaric Sorceress. You can steal various hero cards like Lightforged Cariel. There are just so many cards where if my opponent steals them with Theotar, I'm like considering immediately quitting the game. Of course, you do also have to give your opponent one of your cards, but since you're discovering, you can take their best card and give them your worst card usually. So really, I think this is just an insane disruption card, and you can play it in all 10 classes, so I would be astonished if this ends up seeing 0 play. I think the odds of this getting nerfed are higher than the odds of it seeing 0 play. Finally, we get to see some rogue secrets, starting with Sticky Situation. 2 mana for a secret that says, after your opponent casts a spell, summon a 3/4 spider with taunt. So I think this card is very obviously just good. Cat Trick is one of the best hunter secrets ever. This is pretty much Cat Trick. A 3/4 is probably better than a 4/2, so this card is just good. I think really there's very little else to say about it. Kidnap, another secret. 2 mana after your opponent plays a minion, stuff it in a 0/4 sack. And the Kidnapper's sack is a 0/4 with Death Rattle. Return your opponent's kidnapped minion to their hand. So this is kind of like a freezing trap, but instead of them attacking into it, they have to play their minion into it. And instead of the mana tax, they have basically a 4 damage tax. They have to kill the Kidnapper's sack. Notably, this is after your opponent plays the minion, so it doesn't stop battle cries, which is maybe going to be a little bit of an issue with it. But I still think this card is pretty good. For 2 mana, you get to deny your opponent's play, like say they need to play a Mountain Bear to live or something. This card is just absolutely devastating against a Mountain Bear. And basically anything that doesn't have a battle cry, this is super, super good against. Or even hitting some battle cries, like hitting a Belinda is pretty good, just because she has so many stats. It is kind of a bummer if your opponent just plays like a Jerry-Rig Carpenter or something like that into the Kidnap. But Freezing Trap has been a pretty consistently decent card over the years, and I think Freezing Trap is easier to play around than Kidnap. So I think this card is pretty good, and because of the minion that cares about having a secret in place, you can discard a card from your opponent's hand. Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a very high incentive to play this card, and I think it's good enough. For the final rogue secret, we have Double Cross. 2 mana secret, of course. When your opponent spends all their mana, draw 2 cards. Once again, I think this card is just pretty good. Generally, when you're playing Hearthstone, it should be your goal to spend all of your mana every single turn. I think generally, even if your opponent has a rogue secret in play, you kind of just have to spend all your mana. So I think very often this is just going to be 2 mana, draw 2 cards. It's not nearly as good as that, like in the late game, if you're losing to a control warrior or something, they're more likely to be able to skip the mana and deny the card draw. But I think this is 2 mana, draw 2 consistently enough that you're willing to play it, especially to enable the powerful rogue secret synergies. So yeah, I think all 3 of the secrets Rogue got are actually very playable. Private Eye, 4 mana 3/4 with Battle Cry, cast a secret from your deck. Combo, cast 2 instead. Probably just pretty good if you're playing rogue secrets. 4 mana 3/4 to draw and play a 2 mana card is pretty good. It can be better than that. The rogue secrets are pretty good. The rogue secrets also are just like generally pretty good. There's usually not like a bad turn to play the 3/4 stealth or the draw 2 thing. Kidnap is maybe a little bit awkward, but I think in general you're just always happy to pull rogue secrets out of your deck and put them in play. So I think this card is quite good. Halkias, a rogue legendary. 4 mana 5/4 elemental with Death Rattle. If you control a secret, store Halkias' soul inside of it. It resummons Halkias when triggered. So even though this is the legendary, this is the rogue secret card I am the least convinced of seeing play. All 3 of the rogue secrets are pretty easy to force the activation on. And if you can just make sure your opponent doesn't have secrets in play, then the Halkias simply dies. So if they have Halkias plus a secret, you just play a minion into the Kidnap and then kill Halkias, and it goes away forever. But the rogue secrets do all have pretty different triggers. There's a spell trigger, a play a minion trigger, and a spend all your mana trigger. So you're never really sure what you have to do against Halkias. And if you need to kill it with like a rush minion, you play a Jarin Saber and then it just gets kidnapped, and Halkias doesn't get its death rattle, but it never died, so that's kind of fine. Also notably, you can draw this from sketchy information. I believe that's any death rattle minion that's 4 or less. So you can just have a secret in play secret on turn 2, and then sketchy into it with Halkias on turn 3. Maybe that could be pretty good as well. I think this card is just pretty solid. I think all of the other secret stuff looks pretty good. And if you're already playing all the other secret stuff, you probably just play Halkias. And even in its worst case, it's still a 4-mana 5/4 that is maybe a bit of an inconvenience for your opponent. Orion Mansion Manager, a mage legendary. 4-mana 3/5. After a friendly secret is revealed, cast a different mage secret and gain +2/+2. Well, I would say this card is pretty powerful. You put this in play, the opponent tries to summon a minion to deal with it, it dies to explosive runes, and then Orion is a 5/7 and they still haven't dealt with it. Or you have Counterspell, or they attack into this and Oasis Ally comes out and it immediately gets buffed. Ice Barrier is kind of a stinker, but I think all the other secrets are going to be pretty good with Orion. I guess the new secret, Vengeful Visage, is probably not that great with it either. But I do think if Secret Mage sees play, you probably are going to play this card in that deck. At the moment, I'm not nearly as convinced that Secret Mage will be playable compared to like a Secret Rogue, for example. And I don't think this card is going to put Secret Mage on its back. But in the deck, it's probably pretty good. Widowbloom Seedsman, for Druid. 4-mana 3/2 with Battlecry, draw a nature spell, gain an empty mana crystal. I mean, this card is just obviously insane. Wild Growth on a stick. We've seen that before. It's always been playable. This card is probably better than any of the stuff we've seen before. It draws a card and casts Wild Growth and is a 3/2. People already play Wild Growth, and for 1 more mana, you get a 3/2 that draws a card. This card is just very good. It also hits a nice gap in the curve for Innervate and Coin. So you can turn 2 coin Wild Growth and then play this on curve on turn 4, or on 4 mana. Or if you have this and Nourish, you can coin this out on 3, and then Nourish on the following turn. Also, this does draw a nature spell, so you could maybe have this consistently draw Nourish, but I think Druid probably has too many good nature spells for that. I think you're just going to play this in any Druid deck that cares about ramping. And honestly, you might even play this in Token Druid, or more aggressive Druids, but 4-mana 3/2 is kind of a stinker, so I don't know about that. But overall, a very good card. Moving on to Hunter, we have Stag Charge. 3 mana, deal 3 damage, summon a random Dormant Wildseed. So we have seen the Wildseeds in the past, but if you forgot, there's a 3/1 that's dormant for 1 turn and has Rush, a 2/5 that's dormant for 2 turns and has Taunt, and then the big one is dormant for 3 turns, and then when it awakens, it equips a 4/2 Greatbow, and it's also a 5/4. So 3 mana, deal 3 damage, and then you get a pretty sick minion in the following turns. I think this card is just pretty good. There's an upcoming card that cares about Wild Seeds, but even without that, this card is just kind of good on its own. It's also potentially just good in Quest Hunter, because it's a spell that deals 3 damage. It's just a very solid card. Now we have a Hunter Legendary, Ara'lon. 5 mana 4/5 with Battlecry, summon 1 of each Dormant Wildseed. So you play this, and then next turn you get a 3/1 Rush, the turn after that you get a 2/5 Taunt, and the turn after that you get a 5/4 that gives you a 4/2. This is just an absurd amount of value packed into this card. I would be shocked if this doesn't see play. I mean, even, like, this doesn't have to be in a Wild Seed deck. You just play this in a Hunter deck that has 5 mana ever, I think. It's just so much for 1 card. It's also 4 bodies for Infuse if you care about that, which there are definitely some Hunter cards that do. It's just really good. It's just too many stats to not be good, I think. And finally, for this Wild Seed package, we have Wild Spirits, a 3-mana nature spell that says summon 2 different Dormant Wildseeds, make your Wild Seeds awaken 1 turn sooner. So we have the 2/2 we saw a long time ago that makes Wild Seeds, we have the legendary that makes all 3 Wild Seeds, the spell that makes a Wild Seed, this makes 2 Wild Seeds, and then it progresses all of them. So if you have any Fox Spirit Wild Seeds in play, they just immediately wake up, and you have 3 ones with Rush. And then turning up the clock on your 2/5 taunt and your big stats with weapon is also pretty good. I think even if you don't have other seeds in play, just stand alone, I think this card is pretty good. Yeah, I mean, there's not really much to review about these Hunter Wild Seeds. I think they're all just really efficiently costed cards, and you're probably going to play them. What deck wants to play them? Maybe Quest Hunter doesn't want to, even though the 1 Wild Seed is pretty good in that deck. But I think like Big Beast Hunter probably wants to, Infuse Hunter probably wants to. Most of the Wild Seed cards are multiple minions in a body, which is good for infusing. I think these are just generally very strong Hunter cards. And finally, before tomorrow's big reveal, we have Party Crasher, a neutral 8-mana 7/9 with Battlecry, choose an enemy minion, throw a random minion from your hand at it. So I don't know if it's really been clarified what it means to throw one of the minions in your hand at something, but I assume that it basically summons it and then attacks into it. And if your minion dies, you get its death rattle. If it lives, then, you know, that minion is just in play, minus however much health it took. So I guess this card is potentially pretty good for removal. If you're playing like a Ramp Druid or a Vandar, you know, whatever class you want to put your Vandar in, then you've got some big, like, expensive 10-mana things. You can play this to get a 7/9, maybe you get your other thing down a turn or 2 early, and you can remove something immediately even if your things don't have Rush. So in a deck like that, I could see this being pretty good. It's also good with like Neptulon in particular, because with the Colossals you get your appendages on the Colossals, and I believe Neptulon's effect probably still works, because I'm assuming this just summons and attacks. So that would be pretty strong. You could also do like Moarg Forge Fiend to basically, you'd have a 7/9 that kills something and heals you for 8. That could be pretty strong. Druid is getting some pretty good death rattle stuff to go with this. So I definitely see the potential in this card. My major reservation with this card is in big decks, whether it's Ramp Druid or a Vandar deck, or played like Big Demon Hunter too, you can really only afford to play so many big minions. So like, yeah, this is good with Neptulon and Moarg Forge Fiend and all that stuff, but you have to actually have 2 deck slots for this, which is maybe kind of hard to do, because in a like value-based matchup, for instance, this card is basically just a 0-mana 7/9, which is strong, but it's not as strong as playing like whatever Colossal comes in your class, or, you know, whatever you could be doing. So I definitely see some potential for this card, but I don't think it's a shoo-in, and the decks that this would be good in don't really tend to be that good. So I think there's a bit of an uphill battle for this card, but it is decent.